Good. So, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and students, thanks for coming today to join our Jensen Memorial Lecture. It is a great honor for me to introduce Professor Dr. Andrew Apter from the University of California, Los Angeles to you today. Some of you may already know him from previous collaboration through his numerous publications, or because he was invited to the Frobenius Institute last year. Nevertheless, I would like to take the opportunity to introduce you to the academic work of our guest who has kindly accepted our invitation to deliver this year's Adolf Ellegaard Jensen Memorial Lecture. As you know, every year we select a renowned scientist to give 4 lectures on a central topic of their research work here at Goethe University and with the kind support of the Frobenius Society. I would like to take this opportunity to express my thanks to the chairman of the executive board of the Frobenius Society, who have been working unselfishly for many years now to promote our institute. Without these important leaders of Frankfurt Society, of whom Dr. Meyer-Wegerlin, Dr. Schmieder, Mr. Eckert are here today. Herr Burlauf is also here or not? No, maybe he comes a little later. And without them, we would not be able to undertake all the great academic events and research activities for which our institute is so well known. I would also like to take the opportunity to thank my Frobenius, I say my, I hope it's okay, my Frobenius Institute, the whole team of scientists, archival specialists, photographers, administrative staff also, yes, librarians and student assistants who make our institute such a lively place of research, science, and teaching day in and day out. Recently, the German Science and Humanities Council, the most important institution for the promotion of science in Germany since 1957, awarded our institute an outstanding seal of quality. After a year and a half of evaluation by an international commission of 7 international leading scientists, the Frobenius Institute was praised in the highest terms in an almost 100-page long report. In terms of research, publication, teaching, public relations, international cooperations, and exhibition, the report praises the Frobenius Institute as one of the leading institutions in the field of cultural anthropology in Germany and beyond. I must say, I'm very proud of what my team has achieved in recent years. All of this is recognized in detail in the Council's report with words such as outstanding, exemplary, above average, and many other superlatives. I knew that my team was great, but to have this confirmed by such an important committee was overwhelming. I would therefore like to thank all of those who have contributed to this and who have cemented this important international reputation of our institute. I would especially like to thank my predecessor and colleague, Professor Dr. Karl-Heinz Kohl, who is here today. I just saw him, there he is, who laid the foundations for this outstanding assessment of our institute. This also includes, by the way, this Jensen Memorial Lecture series, which he initiated. So, congratulations to all of you. Thank you. This year, the selection of the speaker was not difficult because during his stay at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Bad Homburg last year, Andrew Apter gave a lecture in a colloquium to which I was invited to introduce him. I was so excited by this lecture that I was keen to hear more from him. After consulting with my colleagues at the Institute, I then asked him at the next opportunity, I think it was the awards ceremony for the best dissertation in cultural anthropology in Bad Homburg last year, whether he would be willing to give the Jensen Memorial Lectures at Goethe University. He did not hesitate for a moment to accept, but he was concerned whether in the current academic climate it was appropriate to give this honor to a somewhat older white man. Thankfully, my insistence that academic quality and expertise in the research field was the only thing that was important to us when inviting somebody to give the Jensen Lecture series convinced him to drop his reservations and give us his commitment for this year. I'm very grateful to him for this because his lecture in Bad Homburg had already made it clear to me what a thoughtful and above all incredibly broadly educated anthropologist and historian he is. At the time, I think I said that his broad knowledge and the complexity of his analysis reminded me of Marshall Sahlins, which he modestly rejected, but I was left with the impression that I had attended a lecture by one of the truly great thinkers in our field. As I learned later, Andrew comes from a family that gave him early access to Africa. My friend and colleague Peter Mark, who would very much like to be here today, told me that he did not know Andrew Apter personally, but that he knew his father well. Curiously, I found out on the internet only that Andrew's father, David Apter, was a famous Africanist political scientist and sociologist who taught at Berkeley and later at Yale. Andrew Apter's early fascination with history and culture laid the foundation for, I must say, a remarkable academic career. Apter studied anthropology at undergraduate and graduate level, a subject that enabled him to explore the complexity of human societies. He later earned his doctorate in anthropology at Yale University, where his dissertation focused on African societies and its rich cultural traditions. This was based on 26 months, really impressive, of field research on Yoruba religion and politics in the Nigerian state of Ondo. This period marked the beginning of his lifelong commitment to understanding and documenting the intricate tapestry of African histories and cultures. Andrew Apter's academic research or career is distinguished by his extensive research and contributions to the field of anthropology and African studies. Apter's research interests are broad, encompassing topics such as ritual, memory, and political power in African societies, Atlantic slavery and racial capitalism, race, gender, and creolization, African epistemologies and philosophies of language, oral history, and archival theory, really a broad range of topics. His interdisciplinary approach has enabled him to explore these topics from a variety of perspectives, including history, anthropology, and cultural studies. Apter's ability to weave these different strands of research together has made him an outstanding figure in this field. He became, quote, an anthropologist among historians, as the UCLA homepage proudly proclaims, echoing the famous title of a book by Bernard S. Cohn, which you may know. Andrew Apter's academic career is characterized by his extensive research and contributions to the field of anthropology and African studies. He began his teaching career at several prestigious universities where he not only imparted knowledge, but also inspired a new generation of scholars. From 1989 to 2003, so more than 14 years, he was professor of anthropology at the University of Chicago, Salins, before moving to the University of California, where he was professor in the Department of History and Anthropology and director of the James S. Coleman African Studies Center. Andrew Apter's research is characterized by its depth and breadth and deals with various aspects of African societies and their historical context. He has written several influential books and articles that have made an important contribution to anthropology and African studies. His publications include, for example, the seminal work Black Critics and Kings, the hermeneutics of power in Yoruba society, first published in 1992. I think this was your PhD or elaborated version of your PhD. In this important book, Apter explores the complex relationship between power and cultural practices in Yoruba society. He examines how rituals, myths, and symbols are used to negotiate authority and social order, providing a deep understanding of Yoruba cosmology and political organization. With this book, he was shortlisted for the Melvin J. Herskovits Award in African Studies in 1993. Another important contribution to African studies is his 2007 book, Beyond Words, Discourse and Critical Agency in Africa, in which he analyzes the power of discourse in shaping social and political reality in Africa. His work emphasizes the importance of language and narrative in African political life. Another monograph entitled The Pan-African Nation, Oil and the Spectacle of Culture in Nigeria, which shows really the breadth of his interests, earned him the Omari Talbot Prize in African Anthropology, awarded by the Royal Anthropological Institute of Great Britain and Ireland. His latest book, named Oduduwa's Chain, Locations of Culture in the Yoruba Atlantic, published in 2018, was honorably mentioned in the Isaac Oluvole Delano Book Prize for Yoruba Studies. This book explores the transatlantic connections between Yoruba culture in Nigeria and their diasporic communities in the Americas. Apter traces the flow of cultural practices, religious beliefs, and historical narratives across the Atlantic. Andrew Apter's contributions to African studies go beyond his own research and publications. Through his involvement in academic institutions, conferences, and editorial boards, he has been instrumental in shaping the direction of this field. His CV lists 25 memberships in various academic societies, advisory boards, and programs. Apter was a mentor to many students and young scientists whom he advised and supported in their research endeavors. We are therefore particularly pleased to have him on board of our masterclass, which offers young scientists the opportunity to plan and critically reflect on their research projects. To summarize, therefore, I would like to say that Andrew Apter's commitment to a deeper understanding of African cultures and histories has helped to elevate not only the field of African studies, but I think social and cultural anthropology in general. Through his research, publications, and teaching, Andrew Apter ensures that anthropology as history and history as anthropology remain relevant in today's academic world. Many thanks for this, and a big round of applause for our guest of honor. So, thank you.
Well, thank you very much for turning out today. I have to thank Roland Hardenberg for an introduction, the likes of which I've never heard before. But if half of what he said was true, I'll be very, very pleased. I know that it's been a long weekend and a long day. Maybe it's good news to hear that today's talk really is more of an introductory setting for the 3 lectures that follow. So I won't be going on until late evening. It's a shorter one. And the title, My Life in the Forest of Spirits, evokes, on the one hand, the work of Amos Tutuola, who has a very famous book, My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, that I believe the last Jensen lecturer incorporated into one of his lectures. It also invokes the anthropological methods of Victor Turner, one of the finest, in my opinion, analysts of ritual, whose work in the 60s and 70s, to my mind, still stands up. And one of his sort of paradigmatic books is called The Forest of Symbols. And then finally, and I know this is a little pretentious presenting this to a German audience, it's like hauling philosophical coals to Newcastle, but I would like to invoke the spirit of German idealist philosophy as developed by the likes of Hegel and his Geist, and because a little bit of that spirit comes creeping into these talks as well as a debt to Immanuel Kant, who I'm also embarrassed to say I've only read in English. But I've also heard that Germans say the Norman Kemp Smith translation in English is more comprehensible than the original German. So that makes me feel a little better, even if it's half true. So you've heard the version of how this invitation unfolded from Professor Hardenberg, and now you're going to hear mine. It's very similar. You would think that we planned this, but we didn't. But it also differs. So here we have an exercise in oral history, where one memory and another memory align, but also diverge a little bit. So I'm going to start reading. The PowerPoint is only illustrative. I'm not going to use it as the structure of my talk, but simply to use it as a kind of slide projector to illustrate some of the points I'm making. So when Professor Roland Hardenberg first invited me to consider giving the Jensen Memorial Lectures, I was taken aback. "You must be joking," I replied with a laugh. "Do you really think that the Frobenius Institute needs another talk from a dude who looks like us?" So you can see the versions are slightly different. My reply rested on shaky empirical grounds, since Professor Hardenberg is younger than I am, slimmer than I am, and overall cuts quite a dashing figure. But my reply was meant more categorically, as an acknowledgement, as he has mentioned already, of the racial, gender, and age-based asymmetries that continue to dominate the Western Academy, and the need to pay more than lip service to the problem. It also reflects the particular intensity of the current struggles for change in North American universities, especially in anthropology departments, where business as usual is no longer tolerated. And the key word there is tolerated. Sometimes it's not even that productive, but the engagement is serious. Professor Hardenberg assured me to let him worry about that his colleagues wanted to hear what I have to say, and then gave me a few days to think about it. So we really are accurately aligned on that one. I checked the list of my distinguished Jensen Memorial Lecture predecessors over the last decade, and only 4 out of 10 fit the hegemonic profile. Not a bad percentage. I then thought about the opportunity to make a compelling case for establishing the Ritual Archive as an empirical and conceptual resource for anthropologists and historians, a growing interest of mine over the last 2 decades. My ego was roused. My pride was piqued. Even the timing worked out, as I would still be on sabbatical for the month of June. The following evening, I gratefully accepted Professor Hardenberg's kind invitation, recalling to myself the final words of Bronislaw Malinowski's infamous diary, "Truly, I lack real character." So now I would like to thank my dear hosts, friends, and colleagues properly, Dr. Sophia Tubaville, who took the lead in arranging my fellowship at the Frobenius Institute and the Forschungskolleg Humanwissenschaften last October, to the director, Professor Roland Hardenberg, and Associate Director, Mamadou Diawara, Professor Diawara, for welcoming me so warmly back in October, to Professor Holger Jebens for seeing my article on Frobenius Unbound, Black Atlantis and the Poetics of Displacement in the Yoruba Diaspora, through to publication in the last issue of Paidoima, and for helping me organize the masterclass associated with this lecture series. And to Dr. Richard Kuba for so generously, Ricard I should say, for so generously sharing his published work and personal primary sources on Frobenius's antics and misadventures in Nigeria, and for encouraging me to locate the lost and possibly purloined Poseidon Alokum bronze, a Yoruba holy grail if there ever was one. And of course, we'll hear more about this in Lecture 4. And for helping me navigate the Frobenius archive with its student assistant, Mathilde Vergara Davila, a veritable polyglot and codebreaker of Frobenius's impossible handwriting, and also to Professor Hans-Peter Hahn for his stimulating discussions about the materialities and political lives of African objects in museums, and to Dr. Susanna Fellings for taking the time to keep me in the logistical loop while producing her extraordinary scholarship on informal trade and markets between the Caucasus and China. I would also like to thank my Forschungskolleg hosts for once again providing such a utopian environment for intellectual life. Irene Iris, Hélène Koban, Beata Suterluti, Christine Wagner, and Peter Neumann. And then finally, my thanks to my friends and colleagues who are here today from all walks of life, from all universities, from different points in this journey we're all in together. By way of an informal segue into today's talk, I'd also like to note how the genre of invited lectures like these, in memory of Adolf Ellegard Jensen, allows a certain degree of license, tempered by obligations and responsibilities. The freedom I have in mind involves limited indulgence in intellectual autobiography, particularly among older speakers au troisième âge, like myself, trying to make sense of their careers in a heroic or anti-heroic narrative, which neither register is equally self-serving. This narrative convention is typically punctuated by clever puns, erudite references, preferably in Latin or French. Think of Marshall Solons's Farewell to Triste Troupe. Or better yet, in the ethnographer's field language. It also involves a Benjaminian pastiche-like tour through prior adventures, ethnographic projects, and of course the mandatory tales from the field illustrating how the ethnographer's stupidity led to a pivotal insight or methodological breakthrough by way of the quasi-Heideggerian stumbling upon, stumbling over, or stumbling into a fallen tree or an unfortunate encounter that leads to a blinding discovery, and many other linguistic cues and stylistic conceits that index inter-guild membership and invite academic cross-cousins to participate in this ritual of collective self-affirmation. I mention all of this not to spare you from this occupational hazard, but to acknowledge it in advance and warn you of what is coming. So the responsibilities associated with this hazardous freedom are legion. Never dwell on the dead hand of competence, which is boring. Do not offend or embarrass your hosts beyond a certain limit, which is rude. Try to control your academic gossip, which can be dangerous. But above all, do not put your audience to sleep. And that would really be and when it's hot and it's at the end of the day, when your blood sugar is kind of groping around, anyway, we've all been there. To this last mandate, I remain deeply committed. It is bad enough for you, dear audience, to trudge off to an invited lecture, especially one that you feel obliged to attend, only to find yourselves fighting to stay awake. It is torturous to have to endure 4 lectures in this key. I recall how Jean Komaroff used to confide while walking to our Monday seminar at the University of Chicago, "I just want to be surprised." Whatever else transpires over these 4 lectures, I will be satisfied if you are not too bored, and I will be very happy if you are at least occasionally surprised. The topic of my lectures on historical ethnography and the ritual archive bears an uncanny kinship with some of Adolf Jensen's central concerns, not just with myth, ritual, and the cultic configuration of cultures, but more specifically, his interests in the kinds of historical memory associated with ritual sacrifices and their problematic pasts. Among what he calls archaic cultivators, for example, Jensen takes pains to specify how, I quote, killings that take place in definite ceremonies regarding the fertility of fields, rainmaking, the curse of barrenness in man or beast, are not rain sacrifices, fertility sacrifices, etc., but reenactments to keep alive the memory of primeval pasts. I was astonished when I read this. And thereby, what he does is identify the central mechanism of memory retrieval in what I am calling the ritual archive, reenactment. And I discuss this further in my second and third lectures. I call this connection with Jensen uncanny because I hadn't read his work until I began writing the lectures that bear his name. In fact, my own interest in the historicity of ritual began with the fieldwork that Professor Hardenberg referred to, that I conducted on Yoruba ritual and politics in Nigeria from 1982 to 1984, and pursued in Nigeria and throughout the Yoruba-Atlantic in subsequent decades. It also motivates my current project on the spirits of racial capitalism in Ghana's historic slave forts and castles, and it informs my developing research both in and on the Frobenius archive. This interest also developed over my 14 years at the University of Chicago. And I can't believe you mentioned Bernard Cohn, because here I am doing the same thing. So I think we're brothers from another mother, or something like that. This interest also developed, So Bernard Cohn was contributing to the rise of subaltern studies in the 1980s, and he continued to reorient the ethnographic eye on the politics of colonial knowledge in India, where the firebrand anthropologists Jean and John Komaroff were locating Africanist ethnography within colonial encounters, occult economies, and more explicitly, within the historical imagination. And also where the late Michel Rolph-Trouillot theorized the deafening archival silences of the unthinkable Haitian Revolution, where Marshall Solons was navigating structures of conjuncture throughout the Polynesian Triangle's islands of history, and where positivism was routinely disavowed by critical theory-driven ethnographic research, while it was also paradoxically protected against the ravages of postmodernism. This was the context where I came into this interest in the historical entanglement with ethnographic and anthropological work. As Manning Nash confessed to me a few months before he died, we are all closet positivists in this department. Manning was one of the more intellectually honest members of our department at that time, ethnographically quite rigorous, although theoretically, as his colleagues would remind him, underwhelming. And I think this suggests an inverse relationship between ethnographic honesty and theoretical audacity. And I think I probably err on the latter side, but what can I say? Against this backdrop, my topic reflects the genesis of my engagement with the complex relationship between anthropology and history that was further fueled by my shift to UCLA in 2003 when with the unenviable moniker of a trailing spouse. I accompanied my partner who had just been hired by the history department and where I was gift-wrapped by the EVC, the Executive Vice Chancellor, that's the man with the real power, the person with the real power at UCLA, offered to the anthropology department, which promptly responded with a resounding 9, whereafter the history department performed some hidden magic and offered me a permanent position. There I was, mirabile dictu, an anthropologist among the historians, to invoke the title of Barney Cohn's seminal volume of his collected essays. So I don't know how we both cited that one. But unlike Barney, I had no prior degree in history, having majored in philosophy and social anthropology as an undergraduate. In any case, after the anthropology department at UCLA subsequently offered me an affiliative olive branch, which I cordially accepted, I joined a vibrant community of historians, and through a gradual process of osmosis, became comfortable and nearly competent within its professional habitus. Whereas the anthropology that I had brought with me was theory-driven, framing research projects to push theoretical debates and perspectives forward, the more timorous and conservative historians, as Evans-Pritchard characterizes them in a 1950 essay, approach theory with measured caution, often mixed with suspicion and disdain. Theory is a means towards an end, a tool to be deployed only if it brings a greater understanding of what actually happened in the past, but never pursued as an end in itself. In other words, whereas anthropologists focus on the political, cultural, and discursive frameworks through which pasts are constructed, represented, distorted, embodied, and even experienced as historical consciousness, historians are more interested in what actually happened. I also came to appreciate how the historian's ontological commitment to the past poses a refreshingly radical challenge to anthropologists to push through these constructions and figurations and discourses that shape the past to answer the much more difficult question, what actually happened? Not a naive invocation of the common sense real, of course, but an admission that at the end of the theoretical day, after the dust of our critiques of master narratives and object construction has settled, the sociocultural worlds of anthropology and their actual pasts are worth getting a handle on. Figuring out what actually happened is much more difficult than merely exploring the sociocultural dynamics that shape, motivate, and mystify the past to retrofit the present, which is largely the way anthropologists engage the past. Anthropology was very suspicious of speculative history and trying to reconstruct histories in societies that don't have written records. They overlooked ritual as one of the sources of historical reconstruction. So I could have titled this lecture, What Actually Happened, because that really is the guiding thread of all of this. Here, forgive the spoiler alert, I would like to adumbrate the first surprise associated with my approach to historical ethnography and the ritual archive, which namely is that the ritual archive can provide invaluable access to what actually happened in the past, something anthropologists have not been really looking at until quite recently. Such a position appears to go against the anthropological grain, given the characteristic, if overemphasized, presentism of mythic charters and their ritualized expressions, and the truism that the content of history is always politically and culturally mediated, such that specific accounts of what really happened, in fact, the events themselves, as Solons so meticulously demonstrates in explaining the death of Captain Cook, can never be separated from cultural logics and schemes. It also carries the whiff of that positivism which subaltern studies and critical anthropology have routinely disavowed. Thus, in An Anthropologist Among the Historians and Other Essays, Bernard Cohn writes, quote, "Anthropologists, in their study of others, encounter constructions of the past which do not fit the European idea of history as an objective, unmediated account of what happened." And he rightly challenges those appeals to the real that have naturalized colonial legacies and knowledges. Similarly, in Ethnography and the Historical Imagination, the Komarovs write, "Any historical anthropology that sustains a fixed dichotomy between the ideological and the objective is bound to run into all the old problems of brute empiricism, not to mention accusations of insensitivity to its own positioning and provisionality." How then do we interpret the histories archived in shrines and are activated by the ritual process? Where do we draw the shifting lines between pasts real and mystified, true and false, and their associated forms of historical consciousness? Do so-called indigenous histories lie on the other side of those Western ideas of what actually happened, based largely on official archives, as a variation of what Dipesh Chakravarti calls History 2 in his path-breaking work, Provincializing Europe? Are ritual histories irreparably damaged and distorted when subjected to the conventional truth conditions of a Western historiography predicated on primary sources, evidentiary standards, periodizations, classifications, chronologies, causal pathways, and often unwitting chronotopic displacements, assumptions that the so-called primitive present represents a period of the past in human evolution? Are they automatically privileged as untrammeled subalternatives to the iron cage of hegemonic historicism? Or, echoing Ernst Cassirer, can we find a common ground for their progressive subsumption into interpretive frameworks of what actually happened. In other words, can we somehow integrate and subsume within a larger framework both the official archival imagination of Western scholarship and the documentation it provides, as well as those forms of historical embodiment manifest in ritual? This latter question of whether we can do this or not is hardly innocent, but it lies at the heart of the current calls for decolonizing the social and human sciences more generally, a term that is particularly relevant to sociocultural anthropology given the colonial conditions of the discipline's genesis. I have neither the time nor space to do justice to this rapidly growing literature, save to signpost key positions and interventions, as well as my own engagement with its Africanist challenges, beginning with Valentin Mudimbe's prize-winning The Invention of Africa, Gnosis, Philosophy, and the Order of Knowledge in 1988, which problematized what he called the colonial library, through which Africanist ethnography was ordered and, as he says, conjugated, and from which the Western preoccupation with secret knowledge, what he dubbed gnosis, becomes symptomatic of a desire for epistemological penetration and conquest, not unlike in Frantz Fanon's famous essay of Algeria Unveiled, France's obsession with an Algeria Unveiled, yes. When Mudimbe's inspiring and difficult book first came out, my initial enthusiasm was tempered by panic. And you also asked me whether Black Critics and Kings was the dissertation, and that is exactly what I'm going to talk about here, because it is and it isn't. And here I have to let you visualize what was actually if I were to be a true Californian in this moment of self-indulgence, I would say that this cover triggers a trauma in me, but it doesn't. But it could have, because imagine that you've worked 18 months writing up a dissertation, and just as you finished it, you read a book that just came out which implicates you in exactly the kind of Western colonial mystification that you thought you were avoiding. It was really quite the challenge. And I say here that Mudimbe's Copernican revolution in Africanist anthropology, it's Copernican because he took, much the way Edward Said looked at Orientalism as the product of a Westernizing colonial knowledge. Mudimbe, in a sense, is doing the same for Africanist discourse. He's showing us that the sort of the scholarly record from really, he goes back to the beginnings of Atlantic trade and exploration in gold and then in slaves, and then formal colonization, that the grammars, the categories, the knowledge forms derived from administrative categories, and that these colonial relationships become invisible in the scholarship itself. So the colonial library becomes the a priori discursive framework of inventing Africa as a Western illusion. And I'll talk a bit more now. Let's see, yeah. So I had just finished my doctoral dissertation on the politics of Orisha worship in Yoruba society, in which secret or deep knowledge, it's called imojinle, played a critical role in destabilizing sovereign authority in the chiefly hierarchies within Yoruba kingdoms. I was very interested in what makes ritual powerful, not just because you believe in it, but because of the way it is practiced. I felt directly implicated by Mudimbe's critique, especially when he asks, and this is quoting him, "One wonders whether the discourses of African gnosis do not obscure a fundamental reality, their own choses du texte, the primordial African discourse in its variety and multiplicity. Is not this reality distorted in the expression of African modalities in non-African languages? Is it not inverted, modified by anthropological and philosophical categories used by specialists of dominant discourses?" These questions resonate with Gayatri Spivak's admonition that, quote, "the subaltern cannot speak," since, invoking Jacques Derrida, all academic attempts to listen to or translate within a dominant discourse, the discourse of the subaltern, can only result in, quote, and I love this quote, "rendering delirious that interior voice that is the voice of the other in us. Now, I fight against this position. A lot of my work, including the book Beyond Words, is precisely to show how we do get out of that, how we get out of the colonial library, and how we also listen to what subaltern folks, so to speak, are saying. And to me, to foreclose the possibility of interpretation and translation is a more serious problem than the translations themselves. In response, I spent the next 18 months revising my dissertation into a book on what I called the hermeneutics of power in Yoruba society. And I'm glad I did, because Mudimbe actually helped me develop, I think, what has been the central insight of that work, accounting for the polyvocal and revisionary strategies of deep ritual knowledge and history, as I'll add, as an indigenous critical theory with powerful political potentialities when put into ritual practice. Not a fixed dogma of hidden myths and meanings, but a safeguarded space for configuring difference and archiving alternative histories and truth claims. So the big shift, really, that Mudimbe helped me develop was, instead of trying to figure out from all the sort of various forms of what I came to learn about as deep knowledge that didn't agree with each other, there seemed to be a multiplicity of sort of oral texts that contradicted each other. What he allowed me to see is that the deep knowledge provides a space of reinterpretation. It's a critical space of reversing the arrows on the dominant discourses. So to a certain extent, it is dialectically related to the dominant discourse that it undermines and opposes. And in that way, it can throw doubt and suspicion into the mythic charters of sacred kingship. Anyway, whether or not I successfully survived Mudimbe's challenge, and I could brag here that Wole Soyinka gave the book a thumbs up in a piece he wrote for Africa Spectrum, which is published by none other than the German Institute of Global and Area Studies in Berlin. So whether I survived it or not, it's important to emphasize that Mudimbe himself provides no real guidance on how more liberated Africanist scholarship should proceed. He was interested in the deconstructive project, which is an important one. But even Paul Duman, the famous deconstructor, argued that there's no point to deconstruction without reconstruction. So I'm a little bit on the reconstructive side. Indeed, Mudimbe's extraordinary mastery of the Western canon, acquired during his many years coming of age in a Jesuit monastery in Rwanda, includes a command of ancient Greek and Latin, in addition to multiple European languages, and his writings resonate with the textual erudition of a medieval scholastic. His PhD dissertation was on the pre-Socratic idea of air, as in atmosphere, the air we breathe, at the Catholic University of Leuven. Contemplating the ruins of his discursive critique of the invention of Africa and its Gnostic limits, Mudimbe concedes the possibility of indigenous African epistemological articulations by acknowledging in the book's final sentence that, quote, the space interrogated by the series of explorations in African indigenous systems of thought is not a void. So the positive content that comes out of this negative critique is the positivity of possibility. He doesn't even bother to go there. But he's cleared the ground for others. Those seeking to illuminate this non-empty space have provocatively pushed his challenge forward, focusing on indigenous African epistemologies as avenues toward liberation and decolonization. In this important development, the Beninois philosopher Paulin Huntongi played a pivotal role, shifting from a genuinely radical rejection of ethnophilosophy as what he called, quote, a crazed language, a discourse that has no referent, to a principled critique of intellectual extroversion in Africa and a reclamation of indigenous knowledge through intellectual reappropriation. High points in this epistemological turn include Archie Mafeje's deconstruction of anthropology with reference to the ex-colonial world, an article that consigns Africanist anthropology to the dustbin of history while resurrecting an indigenous, if problematic, concept of ethnography. Mamo Seydian's Critique de la raison orale, les pratiques discursives en Afrique noire, which focuses on logocentrism in African philosophies. Felwine Sarr's Afrotopia, which relocates economic development within indigenous African sociocultural models. Jacques Dupelchin's Silences in African History, which champions the palaver as a mode of breaking out of the silences and of producing indigenous historical knowledge. The palaver is a traditional form of argument among elders and chiefs, but it was also a crucial treaty-forging institution between Europeans and local merchant chiefs during the slave trade. Also, Chica Eziana Esioba's Indigenous Knowledge and Education in Africa, which develops a refreshing proposal for decolonizing African pedagogy, and Sabelo Ndlovu Gatsheni's Epistemic Freedom in Africa, Deprovincialization and Decolonization, as well as his more recent article on the cognitive empire and struggles for epistemic freedom. Both of these build on the pioneering work of Boaventura de Sousa Santos, a Brazilian theorist, in preparing the ground for what he calls epistemic insurgency. So you get the spirit of this moment where there's a group of scholars, many trained in philosophy, anthropology, usually from the continent of Africa or formerly colonized countries, that are using the idea of resurrecting indigenous epistemological frameworks to develop more appropriate methodologies, more appropriate political forms for their own societies. And I think it's a very interesting development, but again, I have to push back against it in certain ways. Where does the ritual archive stand on this shifting epistemological terrain? While it is tempting to propose the ritual archive as an emancipatory alternative to its Western counterpart, this is not the direction I will be pursuing. Tossing out the Western archive in favor of its non-Western epistemological counterpart is like throwing out a very big baby with oceans of bathwater. You just lose too much. In my current research project on Ghana's slave forts and castles, for example, I could focus exclusively on the shrines, festivals, and spirit worlds that cluster in and around these historic spaces of human commodification to rethink the place of Atlantic slavery in relation to modern capitalism. That is what the book will be about. But I would thereby lose an important longitudinal record of ritual encounters and contexts officially archived in Britain and Ghana, just for starters, which in some cases allow me to pinpoint the emergence of new so-called coastal fetishes in the 18th century. Bracketing the important questions of how we read these archival records without perpetuating their ideological categories and tropes, and the term fetish provides an interesting case in point, the opportunity cost of rejecting them tout court is simply too great. How then do we access what actually happened from both official Western archives and what Solimar Otero calls archives of conjure? So to establish the epistemological ground of this interpretive partnership and its shared horizon of historical possibility, we need a theory of reference. And this is where I hope to surprise you for the second time. Like figuring out what actually happened, theories of reference are not exactly in fashion these days. Actually, not since William Van Orman Quine published Word and Object in 1960, not to mention Husserl's rejection of the natural attitude back in 1910. But what Quine did was he undermined the possibility of a linguistically objective referential apparatus. And it may seem even stranger that I use Immanuel Kant and Ernst Cassirer to get both there and then. For a Kantian of the first critique, I'm sorry, but I did write my senior thesis on the critique of pure reason, and I worked on the subjective deduction, so that's one of the little geists that's coming back to bite me and punish you. So for a Kantian of the first critique, the world in its unconditioned totality is unknowable in itself, because it can only be apprehended within a spatio-temporal manifold of pure intuition as the first transcendental condition of aesthetic experience. Aesthetic in the sense of space and time, not in terms of art and beauty. That comes in his third critique of judgment. Further conditioned by the categories of understanding. In other words, what existed in the past, like what exists in the present, is always already mediated by the same prior conceptual apparatus. We need not get lost in Kant's formidable architectonic to appreciate the significance of his distinction between the unconditioned thing in itself, or noumena, what he critically reformulated as the transcendental object equals X, and phenomenal objects of experience and intelligibility, and the importance of this distinction for establishing what was the case in the past within that horizon of history that must first be temporalized by logics of succession, repetition, causal determination, and so forth to establish the frameworks through which history makes sense. For a Kantian, however, these transcendental conditions are strict and immutable, proven with apodictic certainty by an objective deduction that would obtain universally for any possible history. It took such a neo-Kantian as Ernst Cassirer, building on the Marburg school, to explicitly relativize and historicize this transcendental framework into one of culturally embedded symbolic forms associated with specific modalities of consciousness and understanding: mythic, linguistic, religious, historical, even scientific. The implicit evolutionary development of which need not concern us here. Rather, we can take from Cassirer the transposition of the Kantian a priori and its modes of synthesis into a dynamic philosophy of culture that provides multiple pathways into what actually happened. It is no coincidence that in his reflections on history as a symbolic form, with its archives providing traces of the past, Cassirer, I think, was one of the first to really identify archival records as symbols to be interpreted. So in addition to that, he identifies, quote, religious rites and ceremonies, along with statutes, charters, and political institutions, among the primary sources for retrieving the spirit, another Geist, of the former age, following Herder and Schlegel in identifying history as a kind of palingenesis, a resurrection or rebirth of the past. For Cassirer, the official and ritual archives are less divided by degrees of mystification than they are united as portals for channeling spirits, singular and plural, of past ancestors and ages into the present. The corollary of this latter a priori synthetic proposition, so to speak, and here comes my third surprise, is that all archives are ritual archives, differing not in kind, official Western versus indigenous ritual, but in degree of ritualization. Such a sweeping semantic continuum might appear to deprive the ritual archive of all analytical purchase. Sorry, I lost my place here. So we can distinguish between an empirical concept of ritual archives, referring to shrines associated with collective rites of renewal and purification, and a more abstract understanding of ritualization as immanent in even the most sober bureaucratic institutions and repositories, where documents and materials, including national treasures, are set apart as in sanctified. They are classified in the double sense of systematically cataloged, but also systematically restricted as special collections at increasingly ranked levels of protective custody, ranging from rare and fragile maps and manuscripts where only pencils are allowed and white cotton gloves or nylon gloves must be worn, to top secret national security documents that can only be accessed with specialized clearance. The same thing goes on in the shrines that I work on. That's why I'm laying this out. Even the most secular archives are always somewhat sacred, including those of the Frobenius Institute, as we honor one of its ancestors in this Memorial Lecture series. So here we have a tribal sculpture that looks like an ancestor, a man, presumably of Caucasian origin. He's the eponymous ancestor of what is now the Frobenius Institute. Which in a sense, what I've learned is that he became its founding director in 1920, but of course it wasn't called the Frobenius Institute then, it was the Center for the Study of Cultural Morphology, and he conceived of it as an archive, as an African archive. But I think that it's not a coincidence that this statue, like many statues commemorating sort of notable people from the past, can be seen as a form of sacralization. And it's not just a sacralization in isolation, but in effect it gives birth, not in terms of any sort of blood ideology, but institutional birth to successors. And the first successor being, and I call this the second beginning of the Frobenius Institute, when it is so named by Adolf Jensen, so he names the institute, and now we have a lecture series in his honor. And here we can see him in the field where the blue stripe is apparently Leo Frobenius may be in this photograph, but I don't think it's. Maybe I have this wrong. I don't think it's the man standing on the right. I looked closely. Is it?
That's
It is, okay. And then he was followed by Dr. Carl Schmitz, who unfortunately had a short directorship, getting plucked from this earth prematurely from 1965 to 66. And then his successor, Professor Eike Haberlan, director for quite a long time, 68 to 92. And Dr. Karl-Heinz Kohl, who I'm happy to see here today, very happy actually, who directed from 96 to 2016. And then finally, looking rather dapper, as I mentioned before, Professor Dr. Roland Hagenberg. And we wish you many, many happy years in this position. But don't forget that you will be displaced. You will be displaced, whether it's through patricide, fratricide, we'll see. Okay, I'm jumping ahead here. Okay, so I'm actually going to start wrapping things up. It's been a long day. Thus far, I've characterized the ritual archive as a significant ethnographic and historical resources for accessing the past in ways that break from some standard orthodoxies. First, that the past in question goes beyond the mystifying forms and political interests which it is remembered or recollected, through which it is remembered and recollected. And for those of us who are familiar with Jan Assmann's concept of pneumohistory, it's very much in this vein. He's not concerned with the actuality or facticity of memories that are lodged in rituals, but simply the mechanisms through which it happens. So I'm interested in seeing whether we can get to what actually happened. Secondly, that this past can be accessed with an unfashionable theory of reference in ways I've only alluded to at this point, but will develop more fully in due course, and which involves synthetic a priori principles and procedures with multiple symbolic logics, including traditional medicine and the use of incantation, and the capacity of certain voicings and certain substances to put things together, to connect with, synthetically to connect with people and objects and motives and activities. And also, thirdly, and more abstractly, that all archives are ritualized to some degree. I would like to wrap up today's introductory discussion by reframing these issues in relation to the suppression of history, how archives, ritual and otherwise, both protect and silence the past, and why the question of what actually happened must remain the touchstone of historical and anthropological reason. It is often noted, for example, that historical memories of Atlantic slavery throughout the Black Atlantic are largely repressed, and that there seems to be little historical consciousness of this traumatic and transformative period of human commodification. Anne Bailey begins her exemplary study of African voices of Atlantic slavery among the Anlo Ewe in southern Ghana with the truism that, quote, here and on the other side of the Atlantic, in fact, wherever people of African descent are to be found, there is a deafening silence on the subject of slavery and the Atlantic slave trade, adding that, quote, under the silence are palpable sighs of regret, pain, sorrow, guilt, and shame. Such feelings associated with the dispossessed lives of this silenced history, as Marisa Fuentes also eloquently pursues in Barbados, have little place in the Royal African Company's archives or similar records of the European Royal Chartered monopolies that judiciously documented their human cargo in daybooks, balance sheets, insurance policies, and official correspondence. Nor are they clearly audible to those West African communities that prospered from the so-called African trade, where the historic slave forts and castles of Elmina, Cape Coast, Anamabo, Accra, and others with their so many dungeons, as Sadia Hartman laments, stand as monumental testimonies to this sordid past, in some cases spruced up as UNESCO World Heritage Sites, and others neglected and falling into ruin. On the surface, Ghanaians living on this historic slave coast appear quite indifferent to the human commodities from which their communities prospered, recalling them as northern captives who were passing through. Bio Halsey describes how, when it is acknowledged, this history is sequestered, quote, into specific domains, including private family discussions, references to Northerners, veiled allusions, and minor sections of school textbooks. And she notes that most scholars of collective memories of the slave trade in Africa use ritual as their primary site of analysis. And that's very that gives a very clear example of how within the last 15 years, the use of ritual as a methodology for accessing repressed past has really developed in relation to Atlantic slavery and trying to figure out what aspects of these rituals represent and manifest that repressed experience. So Bayo Halsey herself chooses to focus on public, explicit constructions of the past. So in any case, what then does the ritual archive conceal beneath the surface of public attitudes and sequestered references to Atlantic slavery? Does it bespeak its painful, sorrowful, guilty, and shameful past within its restricted inner chambers and through its public performances? Or does it engage in its own kind of sequestering and whitewashing? The answer, not surprisingly, is both, given ritual's characteristic role in mediating contradictions, both present and past. It is to Bailey's credit that some of her oral histories focus on the Ewe cults of Nyagla and Yeme, which protected their communities against enslavement, but also sold their own citizens and devotees into slavery. One must also be careful to distinguish ritualized idioms of indigenous slavery, in which a devotee serves as a slave to her deity, or a captive gets given to a family and becomes part of that family. We have to distinguish that from those references to Atlantic slavery materialized in whips, coffles, chains, currencies, sacrificial offerings, and sartorial codes in these shrines around the slave forts and castles. But the point cannot be overemphasized that not all secrets within the ritual archive accord with righteous narratives of resistance against slavery. Secret societies working behind the scenes sometimes operated like mafias with illicit networks that crossed forbidden thresholds, conducted the boss's dirty work, or laundered his or her ill-begotten wealth. It should not be surprising that many secret ritual associations in West Africa, such as Poro in Liberia, the Hupila Shrine among the Jola in Senegambia, Nananampao in Fantiland, and the Yora Ogboni Society in Nigeria, as well as the Ekbe Society among the Efik in southeastern Nigeria, which itself was linked to the Igbo Long Juju of Arochukwu. All of these became powerful conduits of hinterland captives in the era of Atlantic slavery, effectively controlling their sphere of circulation, the sphere of that. So what I want to just point out here, I think this one's out of, I wanted to use this Durbar as an example of how colonial administrative categories inform ceremonial interaction. And here we have, through the very mechanism of a Durbar in the north of Nigeria, which is to incorporate local emirs into into one big regional administrative structure, the emirs have to pay obeisance to the British leadership, to the Governor General, and this represents a visit from Britain's Prince of Wales in 1925. And if you look closely, you see that he's leaning down, and it captures the helping hand of colonialism, as well as the asymmetry, because all of this was spelled out in very explicit spatial terms of which chiefs were allowed to sit at what levels in relation to a colonial officer. These I'm just going to point out very quickly. Here's a map from the 1660s, and already you can see from these flags how much this part of the Gold Coast I've just been talking about had been settled, or at least colonized, or at least appropriated and stake-held. These different chartered companies from Denmark, from the Netherlands, from Brandenburg, and of course England, and even Portugal at the first level, were already investing considerable amounts of capital into the trade. And this is what the Postlethwaite map of 1753, it's been identified as the first insert map, because you can see the insert on top is a little segment of the coast. This map shows you the extent to which, by the mid-18th century, this area of the West African coast, the detail of cartographic mapping it's not based on a scholarly mission, it's based on a commercial mission. And it just sort of reflects the extent to which information was coded into these cartographic documents. And here's the map of, I like this one because you see, yeah, it shows you the routes, it documents the routes. This pathway goes to, it's called the road to Kumasi and to Ashanti. And these pathways, which are now highways or roads, were the pathways through which the northern captives were brought down and sold to the Europeans. And I circled the Brafo, called Brufo here. This was the developing leadership of the Fanti Confederacy, which was based on the ritual control over the opening and closing of these roads by fetish priests, which really, I have argued, developed a distinctive form of ritual confederacy as a form of government in which priests had more control than the secular leadership. And then this example from, I mentioned how the Efik society, a secret society, the Ekbe, sorry, in the Efik area here, receives enslaved captives from even further north up in Igbo land. This is to the east of that map I just showed you. And these powerful cults were used for judicial execution. They were also used as sort of to uphold credit and debt relations. If you don't repay your creditor in time, your house can get razed or your head can get cut off. But what you see here is the extent to which these coastal ritual institutions were directly controlling the slave trade. There's a tendency to turn the ritual archive into an archive of righteous resistance, and that's not irrelevant, but it works both ways. And it's very important to understand, why are these secret societies so secret? Because they're selling local kin. They're doing what they're not supposed to do. And why do you need a ritual association? Because when you do that, you are polluting your community, so you have to cleanse it. So a lot of these cleansing ceremonies are about laundering the money, literally, cleaning it from the acquired witchcraft that was generated in its production. And then this will become relevant in a minute. Here's another very interesting Atlantic trajectory. So no wonder that blood oaths of secrecy among the members of these secret societies were sworn on pain of death, because they killed children from their own communities, or that collective first fruits and festivals of purification ceremonies and rituals of renewal, like the lagoon opening Fetuafashe ceremony in Cape Coast, Ghana, they ritually launder the toxic profits accumulated over centuries of slavery by deferring debts to the dead that can never be repaid. Communal memories of slavery in coastal Ghana may appear to be repressed or sequestered into the hushed back rooms of private homes, but they return every year in rituals of collective revitalization that manifest Atlantic histories of Afro-European entanglement, alienation, and exchange. So not all restricted histories belonging to the ritual fields of Atlantic slavery, however, tell the same story. And here the oceanic movement of ritual ensembles represents avenues of both enslavement but also of emancipation that are built into the dialectics of ritual rebirth and renewal. In the transplantation of the above-mentioned Ekpe society from the Bight of Biafra to the docks of Havana and Regla in Cuba in the 1830s, where it became known as Abacoa, the very same ritually sanctioned secret networks that controlled the flow of African captives to the coast of Africa were redeployed in Cuba when they arrived as cargo by Abacoa members, in many cases receiving what were called saltwater slaves, bozales, by then considered contraband, who pooled their profits to finance their own manumission. So the same networks that enslaved West Africans in West Africa became mechanisms of emancipation in the colonies, in the sugar colonies. Paradoxically, the same ritual avenues of human commodification in West Africa led to liberation on Cuba's docks, what I said, and coastal communities like Matanzas. And they appear as dialectically condensed in the Ireme masquerader's hat. So this is a very interesting character within the Abakwa society. It derives from the Nigerian Ekpe, the leopard. And this on the right is the Nigerian photograph from 1910, and this is a painting from the early 19th century of this character, Ireme. And he has this hat on his head is the hat that evokes the Portuguese slave trader, the first layer of European enslavement on the West Coast that was over really by the early 17th century. It was really 1500s to early 1600s, and then the Portuguese got kicked out by the Dutch primarily. So this is the way in which historical memory gets congealed and mobilized as a power that, in activating in appropriating a charged symbol of enslavement, redeploys it for emancipation. So, not all restricted histories belonging to the... Oh, I said this, okay. Right, so similar pathways toward manumission and emancipation were forged by the Yoruba-based houses of Cuban Santeria and Brazilian Candomblé, where alternative sovereignties enshrined in West Africa empowered black communities in the Americas, and when conditions were right, mobilized rebellions like La Escalera, the ladder, against the planter class. So if these and other repressed histories represent pasts that actually happened, how are they ritually archived and accessed? How can we account for their generational transmission while acknowledging critical genealogies of ritual surrogation, the fact that actually origins get swapped out all the time? Original ancestors can be an Indian in one moment, and then an African in another, and a European in another. And how do we transform them into historical narratives without violating their epistemological frameworks? These are some of the questions that I will pursue over the remaining 3 lectures. In the second, I shall sketch the contours and methodology for what I call an operating manual of the ritual archive to help discern the relevant categories and practices of ritual archives when encounters in the field, and to develop a standpoint for working from them with the help of Paul Connerton and Sigmund Freud. The third lecture will explore Yoruba ideas about history and historicity within various ritual contexts from my own fieldwork in Nigeria. And finally, in the fourth lecture, as befits the vexatious spirit of Leo Frobenius, I will turn the entire expedition upside down by exploring the ritual foundations of his Yoruba archive. And if you're still with me, I think you'll be surprised. Danke.